It's a story of betrayal, of one man's vehement desire to liberate his people from Roman rule, and digging deeper into new archaeological evidence about this catastrophic Roman defeat.
It's a battle that would permanently scar Roman imperialism and change German history forever.
For 19 centuries, the battlefield where Rome lost an entire army was missing. No map marked it, and scholars never agreed on where it lay. Then, in 1987, an off-duty soldier with a metal detector walked into a German field and found it. The ground held no grave of 20,000 bodies, just the place where they died, and the proof of how an army fell apart. So how did one man find what every expert had missed? The man with the metal detector. He found it the way a lot of lost things turn up, by accident, with patience and without the permission of the people who were supposed to be in charge of history. Major Tony Clun was a British Army officer stationed in northern Germany during the Cold War. In his off hours, he was a metal detector hobbyist, the kind of person most professional archaeologists quietly dismissed. In 1987, he walked out into a farmer's field near the village of Calcriese, a place long whispered about in local legend, and switched on his machine. What came out of the ground that day should not have been there. Clun found more than 100 silver Roman coins, every one of them older than the reign of Augustus, and 3 small lead bullets made for a Roman sling. Those sling bullets, properly called glandes, were the tell. Soldiers carried them, and they did not carry them into peaceful farmland. They carried them into a fight. Clun had walked into the edge of a battlefield. He kept coming back, week after week, and the field kept giving up its metal. He did what a good amateur does. He reported the find to a professional archaeologist, Wolfgang Schluter, at the nearby University of Osnabrück, and a proper excavation began in 1989. What they were looking for had been hunted for the better part of 1900 years. Generations of scholars had pointed at wrong hills all across northern Germany. The Germans had even raised a giant national monument to the victory, the Hermannsdenkmal, a towering copper statue of the warlord Arminius, dedicated near the town of Detmold in 1875. It was a masterpiece of 19th century pride, and it was built in the wrong place, dozens of kilometers from where the battle had actually happened. What Clun and Schluter slowly uncovered at Calcriese was not a theory. It was a field full of hard evidence, and it ended the guessing for good. The site sat in a narrow strip of low ground called the Calcrieser Nieveder Senke, and the artifacts coming out of it dated to exactly one moment in the early 1st century. By the early 1990s, most scholars were convinced the lost battlefield of Rome's worst military disaster had finally been found by a man out walking in his spare time. The man who had been waved off as a hobbyist had done what centuries of credentialed searching could not. But a field of coins and sling bullets is only the surface of the story. What kind of ground turns an entire Roman army into prey? The bottleneck and the wall. The Calcrieser Nieveder Senke is a thin corridor of low ground squeezed between a steep ridge called the Calcrisi Hill to the south, and in Roman times, a wide and treacherous marsh to the north. There was no room to swing a legion around. There was barely room to march in column, and the only dry path ran straight along the foot of the hill, exactly where an enemy would want that column to be. A Roman legion in the open was a machine of conquest. That same legion, jammed onto a single muddy track with its flanks pinned, was a machine with its gears stripped out, because the enemy had built something for it. Excavation revealed a turf and stone rampart, hundreds of meters long, running along the slope above the path. It had wooden fencing on top, sections reinforced with limestone, and gaps left open here and there as gates. From the Roman side, marching below, it would have been nearly invisible, hidden among the trees and the natural rise of the ground. From the German side, standing on top of it, it was a perfect firing platform, a wall to hide behind and a wall to charge down. The engineering alone is startling. It means the tribes did not stumble into a fight. They prepared a stage. When archaeologists plotted exactly where each coin, each weapon, each broken buckle came out of the soil, the pattern told the story of the collapse. The finds cluster where the column first bogged down and broke apart, then trail along the path as the survivors tried to flee. One haunting detail was a mule skeleton found at the wall, its copper bell packed with grass to muffle the sound. Someone did not want that bell to ring. So if the tribes had spent weeks building a hidden wall and choking the path into a killing ground, what does that tell us about who planned this? It tells us this was no lucky ambush by scattered warriors. It was an engineered kill zone, built in advance by someone who knew exactly how a Roman army moved and exactly where it was weakest. You do not raise hundreds of meters of fortified wall on a guess. You build it because you have been told by someone you trust precisely which road the army is going to take. And only someone the Romans trusted would know that. And that is the part of the story the old textbooks often skip. The wall at Calcriese was not just a Germanic fortification, it was the physical proof of a betrayal, because the only person who could have steered Varus's army onto that exact path was a man standing inside the Roman command itself. So, who was the insider who handed 20,000 soldiers to the enemy? The trap. A friend had set. His name was Arminius, and he was not an outsider. He was a prince of the Cherusci, one of the largest Germanic tribes, and he had grown up, in a sense, inside Rome's world. As a young man, he had been granted Roman citizenship, a rare honor for a tribesman, and he had served as an officer in the Roman auxiliary cavalry. He knew the Latin commands, the marching schedules, the way a legion formed its line, and the way that line came apart when it panicked. In other words, Rome had trained its own worst enemy, and then handed him a seat at the war council. By the year 9, Arminius was back in his homeland, serving on the personal staff of the Roman governor Publius Quinctilius Varus. To Varus, he was the ideal advisor, a local nobleman who spoke the language of the tribes and wore a Roman uniform. Varus trusted him completely. He had no reason to suspect that the young man seated at his table had spent the past year quietly stitching the rival tribes into a single army, bound by one shared conviction that the Romans could be beaten if they were struck together and trapped on ground that stripped away every Roman advantage. He was planning the war while he poured the governor's wine and called him friend. Someone did try to warn Varus. A rival chieftain named Segestes, who hated Arminius for both political and personal reasons, came to the governor and told him plainly that the prince was plotting revolt. Varus dismissed it. He assumed it was petty jealousy between two local rivals and chose to trust his Roman-trained advisor over a complaining neighbor. It was, as it turned out, the most expensive judgment error of his life. Segestes had been right about everything. Late in the summer of the year 9, as Varus prepared to march his legions back toward the Rhine for the winter, Arminius brought him news of a small uprising nearby, nothing serious, just a local disturbance that ought to be put down on the way home. The uprising did not exist. It was the lure designed to pull the army off the safe Roman road and into the forests, toward a narrow path Arminius knew, and Varus did not. Varus gave the order to march. He would later wish, in his final hours, that he had listened to the other chieftain instead. And so an army of roughly 20,000 men, 3 full legions with their cavalry, their baggage train, their servants, and their families, turned off the road and walked into the trees. They believed they were heading out to crush a minor rebellion. In reality, they were walking toward the wall at Calcrise and toward the man who had built it. So what happened to them once the road ran out? 4 days in the mud. What happened was a slaughter that ground on across several days. The army Varus led was enormous, somewhere around 20,000 soldiers, plus the camp followers, the supply wagons, and the families that traveled with a Roman force on the move. On an open field, this column was nearly unbeatable. On a narrow forest track in autumn rain, with the trees pressing in on both sides, it was a slow-moving target the size of a small town, and someone had chosen this ground for them on purpose. The first attacks came not as a battle, but as a hail of javelins from the trees, launched by warriors who knew every path and every clearing. The Romans could not form the tight formations that made them deadly. Their armor, their shields, their drill discipline, all of it was built for open ground. In the mud and the rain, weighed down by heavy equipment, they could barely keep their footing. The column stretched out, broke apart, and began to die in pieces. Every time they tried to form a shield wall, the trees and the wagons broke it apart before it could close around them. Ancient writers, especially the historian Cassius Dio, describe the horror in grim detail, men slipping in the muck, officers shouting orders no one could hear over the storm, and the dead piling up until the living had to climb over them. Rain turned the track into a channel of mud. The army's own baggage train became an obstacle, blocking retreat as surely as the warriors in the trees. If a trained army's greatest strength is its order, what is left of that army once the order is gone and the road has turned to swamp? By the fourth day, the survivors had been herded into the bottleneck at Calcrease, where the wall and the marsh left nowhere to run. Varus, seeing that there was no way out and unwilling to be taken alive by the tribes, fell on his sword in the old Roman fashion. With their commander dead, the last resistance collapsed. Roman writers record that the survivors were tortured, hanged, and burned, and that skulls were nailed to the trunks of trees as offerings to the gods. It was, by any measure, one of the worst military disasters Rome ever suffered. In a matter of days, an entire provincial army had ceased to exist. An entire field army had walked into the forest, and almost none of it walked out. 3 legions, 3 sacred eagle standards, a Roman governor, and tens of thousands of men simply vanished into the German woods. But the truly strange part of this story is what happened next, because the army's disappearance was only the beginning of a panic that reached all the way back to the emperor himself. What did Rome do when an army simply stopped existing? Give me back my legions. It panicked. When word of the disaster finally reached Rome, the Emperor Augustus was, by every account, shattered. The historian Suetonius wrote that for months afterwards, Augustus let his hair and beard grow uncut, a sign of deep mourning, and that he would wander the halls of his palace, beating his head against the doors, crying out the same words over and over. Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions. The words are recorded by Suetonius, and they have echoed through history ever since. He never got them back. The 3 legions that died at Calcrease, the 17th, the 18th, and the 19th, were struck from the army list and never reformed. That was almost unheard of. Rome had lost legions before, and it usually rebuilt them under the same number, the same name, the same eagle standard. Not these. Their numbers were retired like the names of the dead, a permanent scar across the army's record. The numbers 17, 18, and 19 were simply never spoken of again in the ranks. The defeat redrawn the map of Europe. Augustus abandoned his plan to push the imperial frontier all the way east to the Elbe River, and the Rhine became the permanent edge of the Roman world. East of that river, the land stayed Germanic. Historians have argued ever since that this single battle fixed the divide between a Latin, Romanized Western Europe and a Germanic East, a fault line you can still trace through the languages and the borders of the modern continent. Without Calcrease, there may have been no separate Germany on the map of Europe, no clean split between the Latin West and the Germanic East. 6 years later, in the year 15, a Roman general named Germanicus marched back into the forest to avenge the dead, and what he found there explained a great deal about why no mass grave was ever found at Calcrease. The historian Tacitus recorded the scene. The ground was still littered with whitening bones, scattered weapons, and the bones of pack animals. Skulls still hung nailed to the trees. Germanicus and his men gathered what remained and buried it, as much dignity as the moment allowed. Even the hardened legionaries who marched with Germanicus were said to be shaken by the sight of it, so the bodies of the lost army were never gathered into one place. They were left to the forest, picked over by looters and weather for 6 years, and only partly buried by a grieving relief force. That is the real reason there is no graveyard of 20,000 Romans at Calcrease. Not because the dead were never there, but because the dead were never collected. The forest absorbed them, and for 19 centuries it kept the secret. So what, after 2,000 years, actually came out of that ground? What the ground still holds: more than 6,000 objects and not a single mass grave. That is the honest accounting of what the Calcrease excavations have produced so far. The site has yielded weapons, tools, fragments of armor, and over 1,700 Roman coins, not one of them minted after the year 9. Some of the coins even bear a small stamp reading VAR, the mark of Varus himself, pressed into the silver when he paid his troops. The dating is airtight. No coin from a later emperor ever turned up at Calcrease. Among the most famous finds is a delicate silver face mask, once part of a Roman cavalryman's parade helmet, unearthed in the soil where a horseman fell. There are nails from the heavy military sandals called caligae scattered all along the path. And there are human bones, some still carrying the deep-cut marks of blades found in shallow pits where Germanicus's men hastily buried them. These are not the remains of 20,000 men in one grave. They are fragments, the residue of a massacre that the forest swallowed whole. Each fragment is a single soldier's ending, pinned to a single square of soil. There is one Roman whose face we can still see, even though his bones never came home. A tombstone found far from the battlefield in the Roman town of Vetera commemorates a centurion named Marcus Caelius. He was 53 years old, a senior officer of the 18th Legion, and his inscription records that he was killed in the War of Varus. His family set up the stone knowing his body was still somewhere out in the forest. If a man could vanish so completely that his own memorial stands empty, what does it really mean to say an army was found? Today, the field at Calcrease is a museum and an archaeological park, the Varusschlacht Museum und Park Calcrease, and the digging has never fully stopped. What the ground gave back was never a cemetery. It was a crime scene, mapped coin by coin and bone by bone, enough to settle a 1,900-year-old argument about where Rome's worst disaster happened and exactly how. An off-duty soldier with a detector found what professors had been hunting for since the Renaissance. Sometimes history is found by the person willing to walk the field one more time. So the headline, the one about 20,000 bodies, is true in the only way that really matters. 20,000 Romans did die in that forest, and we can now stand on the exact ground where it happened. What was never found was a neat pile of skeletons, because there never was one. The army died scattered, and the forest kept the pieces. They didn't dig up 20,000 bodies. What they dug up was the field where they fell, the hidden wall that trapped them, and the empty memorial of a centurion. It was never buried in one place, which is why no one found it for 19 centuries. Was it the greatest ambush ever built, or the greatest betrayal? Leave you thoughts in the comment section below.